My wife is replaceable. Ethan Walker said it so casually across the polished conference table that even his lawyer looked uncomfortable. After 28 years of marriage, that was what I had become to him. Replaceable. I stared at the man I once loved while his young girlfriend waited outside the glass office doors, smiling like she had already won. But Ethan made one mistake that day. He thought I was walking away with nothing. What he didn't know was that buried inside an old storage box in my garage was a secret powerful enough to destroy everything he had built. And before this divorce was over, I was going to replace him with someone far richer. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who once promised to love you forever, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you're listening tonight, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes these stories hurt a little less. Don't forget to like and subscribe if stories about strength, betrayal, and second chances speak to your heart. There was a time when Ethan Walker used to hold my hand like he was afraid the world might steal me from him. Sometimes I think that version of my husband died long before our marriage did. Back when we first met, Chicago, winters felt colder, our apartment felt smaller, and our dreams felt impossibly big. Ethan was 29 then, all ambition and charm with dark hair that never stayed in place, and a smile that made people trust him too quickly, including me. I was 30 years old working as an accountant for a manufacturing company downtown. My life was organized, stable, predictable. Ethan was the exact opposite. He was reckless in a way that felt exciting back then. He talked about real estate the way preachers talk about faith. Chicago is changing, he used to say while sketching ideas onto napkins at our favorite diner. People who move first are going to build fortunes here. I believed him. More importantly, I believed in him. When we got married, Ethan had almost nothing besides a used pickup truck and a head full of plans. I had savings, a reliable job, and a small inheritance my parents left me after they passed away within 2 years of each other. My mother once warned me to be careful with that money. Never hand your entire future to another person, Chelsea, she told me. At the time, I thought love made those kinds of warnings unnecessary. I was wrong. During the first years of our marriage, we lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the north side of Chicago. The pipes rattled every winter. The heater worked only when it wanted to. Sometimes we could hear our neighbors arguing through the walls. But I was happy then. I worked full-time during the day and came home to help Ethan organize invoices, contracts, and budgets late into the night. I learned the financial side of his business because he hated paperwork. "You're the real brain here," he used to joke while kissing my forehead. I still remember the night we decided to risk everything. Ethan had found an old 6-unit building in a rough neighborhood. Nobody else wanted it. The plumbing was terrible, the roof leaked, and half the apartments were vacant. But Ethan looked at it like a man staring at buried treasure. "We can turn this around," he told me, pacing our tiny kitchen. "I know we can. We don't have enough money. We do if we use your inheritance." I remember the silence that followed. Even then, a part of me hesitated. That money was the last thing my parents had left me. Security, protection, a future if life ever fell apart. But Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind and whispered into my hair, "One day, we'll laugh about how scared we were." So I said yes. I signed papers I barely read because I trusted my husband more than I trusted myself. That building became the foundation of everything Ethan later built. Within 5 years, we owned 3 more properties, then 7. Then an entire portfolio of renovated apartment buildings across Chicago neighborhoods that were suddenly becoming fashionable and expensive. Money changes people slowly at first, like rust. You don't notice it until something starts breaking apart. The first thing that changed about Ethan was his schedule. Then his clothes. Then the way he spoke to people, especially me. At business dinners, he stopped introducing me as the woman who helped build the company. Instead, I became my wife, Chelsea. Just Chelsea. Background decoration. The older we got, the younger the people around Ethan seemed to become. Young investors, young assistants, young women laughing too hard at his jokes. And while Ethan transformed into the kind of wealthy man who appeared in local business magazines, I quietly became invisible, at least to him. I noticed it in little moments first. The way he checked his phone while I spoke. The way he sighed when I asked him to spend time with me. The way his eyes drifted toward younger women in restaurants without even trying to hide it anymore. One night, I spent 3 hours cooking his favorite meal for our anniversary. Pot roast garlic mashed potatoes, homemade peach cobbler. I even lit candles. Ethan came home nearly 2 hours late. He loosened his tie, glanced at the table, and frowned. "You waited for me to eat?" I smiled nervously. "It's our anniversary." "Oh." He looked genuinely surprised. "Right." He sat down for less than 10 minutes before answering a phone call and walking into his office. I ate dinner alone that night. That should have been the moment I accepted the truth, but women like me are dangerous in one particular way. We know how to endure. So instead of leaving, I tried harder. I dyed my hair darker because Ethan once mentioned that lighter hair made me look older. I started buying expensive skincare products I didn't even understand. I lost 15 pounds. I smiled more, complained less. None of it mattered. Because the problem was never my age. The problem was that Ethan had started seeing loyalty as weakness. One Saturday morning, I walked into his office carrying coffee and overheard him laughing with one of his business partners over speakerphone. "Man, you're lucky," the partner joked. "Most women would have taken half your company years ago." Ethan laughed. "Chelsea doesn't even know how much the company's worth." Something inside me cracked when I heard that. Not because it was cruel, because it wasn't true. I knew exactly how much the company was worth. I had helped build every inch of it. I just never imagined Ethan could someday look at me and forget that. That afternoon, while cleaning old paperwork in the basement storage room, I found myself staring at dusty boxes filled with records from the early years of the business. Tax returns, loan applications, property contracts, and one old leather folder I hadn't seen in decades. I picked it up slowly. Something about it made my stomach tighten. Inside were copies of documents from the very first property Ethan and I ever purchased together. My signature sat beside his. Not underneath his, beside it. Equal ownership. I stared at those papers for a long time while memories flooded back into me. The inheritance money, the down payment, the bank refusing Ethan's loan application until my financial history was added. I suddenly remembered something else, too. Something Ethan clearly hoped I had forgotten. The company that later became Walker Development Group had originally been registered under a temporary partnership connected to that first building, and part of that partnership still legally traced back to me. For the first time in years, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt awake. The first time I met Sophia Reed, she kissed my cheek like we were old friends. That was what made her dangerous. Women like Sophia never walk into a room loudly. They arrive smiling, soft voice, perfect posture, eyes that study everything while pretending not to. It happened during Ethan's company holiday gala at the Palmer House Hilton downtown. I almost didn't go that night. By then, Ethan had already spent months treating me like an obligation instead of a wife. We barely had conversations anymore, unless they involved schedules appearances or charity events he needed me to attend. But he insisted I come. It's important, he said while adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. Investors will be there. Not because he wanted me there. Because a successful businessman looked more respectable beside a wife who smiled quietly. I spent over an hour getting ready that evening. At 58, the mirror had become a complicated thing. Some days, I saw strength in my reflection. Other days, I only saw the years Ethan had stopped loving me through. I wore a navy blue dress I used to know Ethan liked. He barely looked at me before we left. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and money. Crystal glasses, tailored suits, women with smooth skin and bright white smiles. Everything smelled expensive. Ethan disappeared into conversations almost immediately. That used to hurt me. Now, it just exhausted me. I stood near the bar pretending to admire the decorations when I noticed her across the room. Sophia Reed. She was beautiful in the polished, deliberate way magazine women are beautiful. Long dark hair, sharp cheekbones, elegant white dress that fit her like it had been sewn directly onto her body. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention. It was Ethan's face when he looked at her. I hadn't seen my husband smile like that in years. Sophia laughed at something he said and touched his arm lightly. Not too long. Just enough. A young bartender stepped beside me. Another champagne, ma'am. Before I could answer, a smooth, feminine voice interrupted. Oh my God. You must be Chelsea. I turned around. Sophia stood there smiling warmly, holding out her hand. I'm Sophia Reed. Ethan's told me so much about you. Something about the sentence felt strange immediately. Not Mr. Walker. Ethan. Like his name belonged comfortably in her mouth. I shook her hand politely. Nice to meet you. You're even prettier in person, she said. Women know when compliments are weapons. This one was wrapped in silk. Thank you, I replied carefully. Sophia tilted her head slightly. Ethan says you've been with him since the very beginning. That's honestly so sweet. Sweet. Not impressive. Not admirable. Sweet. Like I was an old photograph someone keeps for sentimental reasons. Before I could respond, Ethan suddenly appeared beside us. There you are, he said to Sophia first. Then he glanced at me. You okay? The difference in his tone hit me harder than I expected. Warm for her. Obligated for me. Sophia smiled brightly. I was just telling Chelsea how inspiring your success story is. Ethan laughed. Chelsea remembers when I could barely pay rent. I remember when we both could barely pay rent, I corrected gently. Something flickered across Ethan's face. Annoyance, tiny, quick. But there, Sophia rescued the moment instantly. Well, she said lightly, look at you two now. But while she smiled at me, her eyes stayed on Ethan. The rest of the night felt like watching my marriage happen from outside a window. Everywhere I turned, Sophia was there, laughing beside Ethan, whispering into his ear, standing too close. At one point during dinner, I watched her place her hand on his shoulder while showing him something on her phone. Ethan leaned toward her, instinctively smiling, in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I suddenly felt old. Not physically, emotionally. Like I had become furniture in my own life. Later that evening, I excused myself to the restroom just to breathe for a moment. Two younger women stood near the sinks, touching up makeup. They stopped talking when I entered. Then one of them said quietly, thinking I couldn't hear. That's Ethan Walker's wife. The older one, a pause. I heard he's leaving her. I kept my face calm while washing my hands. But inside me something trembled. When I returned to the ballroom, Ethan and Sophia were gone. I found them 15 minutes later, near the outdoor terrace overlooking the city lights. They stepped apart when they saw me. Too quickly. Ethan cleared his throat. "There you are." Sophia smiled smoothly. "We were just discussing the Milwaukee project. At 10:30 at night, alone, on a terrace." I nodded anyway, because sometimes women already know the truth long before they're willing to say it out loud. On the drive home, I stared out the passenger window while snow drifted through downtown Chicago. Finally, I asked quietly, "Are you having an affair?" Ethan gripped the steering wheel harder. "For God's sake, Chelsea, that's not an answer. You're being paranoid." His voice carried irritation now. "I saw the way she looks at you." "And how exactly is she supposed to look at her boss?" I swallowed hard. "You smiled at her tonight, more than you've smiled at me in years." Ethan let out a cold laugh. "This is exactly why I hate bringing you to events lately." The words hit me like ice water. "What does that mean?" "It means everything turns into drama with you now." Drama. That was what my pain had become to him. By the time we reached home, neither of us spoke. I lay awake long after Ethan fell asleep beside me, staring at the ceiling while questions tore through my mind. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was insecure. Maybe age had made me overly sensitive. That was the cruelest part about emotional betrayal. It slowly teaches you not to trust your own instincts. Over the next several weeks, Sophia became impossible to avoid. Ethan mentioned her constantly. "Sophia thinks the branding should be updated. Sophia handled the investors perfectly. Sophia's brilliant with marketing. At dinner, in the car, during phone calls." It was like another woman had quietly moved into my marriage without physically entering the house. Then came the business trips, late meetings, text messages Ethan suddenly hid when I walked near him. One night, his phone buzzed while he showered. I wasn't trying to snoop. At least that's what I told myself. But the screen lit up beside me on the bed. "Sophia." "Miss you already?" My entire body went cold. I stared at the message until the screen faded black. When Ethan came out of the bathroom, I held up the phone silently. For one brief second, guilt crossed his face. Then anger replaced it. "Were you going through my phone?" I could barely speak. "She says she misses you. It's harmless." Harmless. "You're overreacting." I stood there shaking. "Are you sleeping with her?" Ethan exhaled dramatically, like I was exhausting him. "You know what your problem is, Chelsea? You've built your entire identity around being my wife." I felt tears burning my eyes. "That's not true, isn't it?" he snapped. "You don't even know who you are outside this marriage anymore." The cruelty of that statement stole the air from my lungs because part of me feared he was right. Ethan grabbed his jacket. "Where are you going? I need space." At midnight, he turned toward me with a look I'd never seen before. Cold, detached, almost irritated that I still expected explanations. Then he left, and deep down, I knew he wasn't going to the office. The divorce meeting took place on a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. Cold rain streaked across the windows of the law office while I sat at the end of a polished mahogany table, wondering how 28 years of marriage could be reduced to folder signatures and carefully rehearsed cruelty. Ethan arrived 15 minutes late, not alone. Sophia walked in beside him, wearing a cream-colored coat and heels sharp enough to stab through concrete. She wasn't supposed to attend the meeting. Even Ethan's attorney looked surprised when she entered. But Sophia smiled confidently, like she belonged there. Like she already owned part of my life. "Traffic was awful," Ethan said casually, while taking his seat across from me. Not once did he ask how I was doing. Not once did he look sorry. His attorney, Martin Keller, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ms. Reed," he began carefully, This meeting was intended for immediate parties only. Sophia touched Ethan's shoulder lightly. I'll just wait outside. Ethan nodded without even glancing at me. Whatever you want, sweetheart. Sweetheart. The words sliced through me far deeper than I expected. Sophia gave me one final smile before leaving the room. It wasn't a victorious smile. It was worse. Pity. As soon as the door closed, Martin slid a stack of documents toward me. These are the proposed settlement terms. I opened the folder slowly. My hands remained steady, even though my heart didn't. The numbers made my stomach tighten immediately. The house, minimal spousal support, limited asset division. It was insulting. Not because I cared about luxury anymore, because it erased my role in building everything Ethan owned. I looked up carefully. You can't be serious? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Calm, relaxed, almost bored. It's fair. Fair? I let out a small, disbelieving laugh. I helped build your company. My company, he corrected immediately. The room fell silent. I stared at him. For a moment, I saw flashes of the man I married. The younger Ethan who kissed my forehead while we balanced unpaid bills on our kitchen table. The man who once promised we were partners. That man was gone now. In his place sat someone colder. Someone wealth had hollowed out from the inside. Martin shifted uncomfortably. Chelsea, legally speaking, many of the core assets were structured under Ethan's ownership after expansion. After expansion, I repeated quietly. Ethan folded his hands together. You were never involved in the business side at that level? I almost laughed again. I had handled invoices while pregnant with stress and exhaustion in our tiny apartment decades earlier. I had balanced accounts when Ethan couldn't afford accountants. I had tracked debts, budgets, taxes, loans. But now that the company was worth hundreds of millions, suddenly I had never been involved. The gaslighting was almost impressive. You know that isn't true, I said softly. Ethan sighed heavily, like I was being unreasonable. Chelsea, let's stop pretending here. Pretending! That word landed strangely, like he had been rehearsing this version of history for a long time. He leaned forward slightly. You were my wife. You supported me emotionally. Nobody's denying that. Emotionally. Not financially. Not professionally. Emotionally. Like I'd spent 30 years baking cookies instead of helping build an empire. My chest tightened, but I refused to cry in front of him. That was what Ethan expected. Weakness. Desperation. Begging. Instead, I asked quietly, did Sophia help you prepare this settlement? Ethan's jaw shifted slightly. What does that matter? Because that was all the answer I needed. Martin quickly interrupted. Let's keep this productive. But Ethan suddenly laughed under his breath. Not kindly, not nervously, cruelly. You know what your problem is, Chelsea? He asked. I looked at him silently. You still think this marriage was something extraordinary? I felt the air leave my lungs. Ethan continued before I could respond. It wasn't. The words sat between us like broken glass. I saw even Martin glance downward awkwardly, but Ethan kept going. You were a good wife for a long time. Comfortable, reliable. But people change. My throat burned. You promised forever. That's what people say when they're young. I swallowed hard. So that's it. 28 years, and suddenly, I'm disposable. Ethan stared directly into my eyes then, and that was the moment he said the sentence that would replay in my mind for months afterward. You're replaceable, Chelsea. Silence. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Ethan's expression remained emotionless as he continued. I know that sounds harsh, but it's reality. People move on. You should too. Replaceable. Like an old couch. Like outdated office furniture. Like the woman who stood beside him while he built every piece of the life he now used to humiliate me. For one dangerous moment, I thought I might completely fall apart. But then something unexpected happened. I remembered the leather folder downstairs in my storage room. The old partnership documents. My signature. The ownership records. And suddenly, beneath all the heartbreak, another emotion began rising quietly inside me. Awareness. Ethan thought I knew nothing. That was his biggest mistake. I looked down at the settlement papers again, then slowly closed the folder. No, I said calmly. Ethan frowned slightly. No, I won't sign this. A flicker of irritation crossed his face immediately. You don't have much leverage here? I almost smiled. Almost. Maybe not. Martin adjusted his glasses carefully. Chelsea contesting this could become lengthy and expensive. I turned toward him politely. I understand. Then I looked back at Ethan. For the first time in months, I truly saw him clearly. Not the man I married. Not the father I once imagined we might become. Just an aging, wealthy man terrified of losing control. And beneath all his confidence, I suddenly sensed something else too. Fear. Because Ethan knew cruelty only works when the other person stays broken, and I wasn't broken anymore. Not completely. Ethan leaned back again, clearly annoyed now. Why are you smiling? I hadn't even realized I was. The smallest smile touched my lips. Not happiness, not revenge, certainty. I was just thinking, I said softly, about what I held his gaze for several long seconds, about how little you actually know. His eyes narrowed immediately. What's that supposed to mean? But before I could answer, the office door opened, and Sophia stepped back inside, carrying coffee cups. Her perfume filled the room instantly. She handed Ethan his drink first, then she looked at me sweetly. Everything okay in here? I stared at her for a moment. Young, confident, certain she had won. And suddenly, I felt strangely calm. Because neither of them understood something yet. People underestimate quiet women all the time, especially older women. They mistake endurance for weakness, silence for ignorance, loyalty for stupidity. Ethan accepted his coffee and looked at me impatiently. So, what exactly are you planning to do? Chelsea, I stood, slowly gathering my purse. For years, I had spent my life making Ethan feel bigger. That morning was the first time I stopped. I'm planning, I said quietly, to stop underestimating myself. Then I walked out of the conference room. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, I left Ethan sitting in silence behind me. 3 days after the divorce meeting, I found myself sitting alone inside a small coffee shop on Oak Street that Ethan and I used to visit before we had money. Back when life still felt honest. The place had barely changed over the years. Same dark wooden floors, same jazz music humming softly through hidden speakers, same smell of espresso and cinnamon drifting through the air. I used to love that smell. Now it made me mourn a version of myself I barely recognized anymore. I sat near the window wrapped in my coat, staring into untouched coffee, while rain slid down the glass outside. For the first time in nearly 30 years, I had no idea what my future looked like. The silence after a long marriage ends is terrifying. People don't talk enough about that part. Not the screaming arguments, not the betrayal. The silence afterward. The sudden realization that the person who shaped your daily life for decades can wake up one morning and decide you no longer matter. I kept hearing Ethan's voice in my head. Replaceable. The word followed me everywhere now. At night, in the shower, while brushing my teeth. While staring at old photographs I still hadn't gathered the strength to pack away. You're replaceable, Chelsea. I closed my eyes tightly. Chelsea Morales. The voice startled me so badly I nearly dropped my cup. I looked up, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Gabriel Bennett stood beside my table. Older, of course. We both were, but time had somehow sharpened him instead of softening him. His silver hair was neatly styled, his charcoal overcoat perfectly tailored, and his deep brown eyes carried the kind of calm confidence that only comes from surviving life instead of performing it. I hadn't seen Gabriel in over 20 years. Not since Ethan's company became large enough to move in circles far above the neighborhoods where all of us started. "Oh my God," I whispered. Gabriel smiled warmly. "I was hoping that was really you." For one strange second, I felt 30 again, back before mortgages, betrayals, and loneliness became permanent residents in my life. "Gabriel," I said softly, "what are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing." He gestured toward the empty chair. "May I?" I nodded slowly. As he sat down across from me, memories flooded back unexpectedly. Gabriel and Ethan used to know each other years ago, during the early days of Chicago real estate development. Gabriel had always been quieter than Ethan, more observant, less desperate to impress people. Back then, I remember thinking Gabriel listened better than most men. I also remembered something else. Before Ethan and I got serious, Gabriel had asked me out twice, and I had said no both times, not because I disliked him, because I had already fallen in love with Ethan's fire. Funny how dangerous fire looks beautiful when you're young. Gabriel studied my face carefully now. "You look tired," he said gently. "Not old, not worn out. Tired." The honesty in it nearly broke me. I forced a small smile. That obvious only to someone paying attention. That sentence hit me harder than he probably intended, because Ethan hadn't truly paid attention to me in years. A waitress approached the table. Gabriel ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. Somehow that small confidence felt strangely comforting, so he said carefully, after the waitress walked away, "I heard about the divorce." Of course he had. In Chicago, business circles, wealthy men divorcing their older wives for younger women wasn't exactly private information, especially when Ethan Walker was involved. I looked down at my hands. "I'm sure people are enjoying the gossip." Gabriel's expression darkened slightly. "I'm not." Silence settled between us for a moment. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows while people hurried down the sidewalks beneath umbrellas. Finally, Gabriel leaned back slightly. "I saw Ethan 2 months ago in New York. That caught my attention immediately." "You did?" Gabriel nodded once. "He mentioned Sophia. The way he said her name told me everything. Carefully, disapprovingly. He seems very impressed with her," I said quietly. Gabriel gave a small, humorless laugh. "Ethan has always been impressed by people who flatter him." I stared at him. There was history in that sentence? Old history. Painful history. "You don't like him much anymore?" I observed carefully. Gabriel looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "There was a time I respected Ethan a great deal. And now, his jaw tightened slightly. Now, I think success exposed parts of him that were always there." That answer sat heavily between us. The waitress returned with coffee. Gabriel thanked her politely before looking back at me again. "You know," he said quietly, "when I heard about your divorce, I wasn't surprised. That hurt more than I expected." "You think I should have seen this coming?" "No," he said immediately. "I think you loved him longer than he deserved." The tenderness in his voice almost undid me completely. I looked away quickly before tears could form. For years, I had felt invisible, dismissed, aged out of relevance, but Gabriel looked at me like I was still fully human. That alone felt dangerous. I don't even know who I am anymore, I admitted softly. Yes, you do. I shook my head. No. I spent almost 30 years building Ethan's life. Everything I did revolved around him. Gabriel watched me carefully. And what did Ethan build for you? I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out, because I suddenly realized I didn't know. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not even financially, apparently. The silence gave Gabriel his answer. He leaned forward slightly. Chelsea, may I tell you something? Honestly? I nodded. You were always smarter than Ethan? I blinked in surprise. That's not true. Gabriel smiled faintly. It absolutely is. I almost laughed. You clearly haven't seen me lately. No, he said quietly. I think you've spent years shrinking yourself so Ethan could feel bigger. The words landed directly in my chest. Because deep down, I knew they were true. Gabriel stirred his coffee slowly before continuing. Do you remember the Harbor Point deal? My stomach tightened immediately. It was an old development project from nearly 15 years ago. Ethan used to call it the deal that transformed his company permanently. Yes, I said carefully. Gabriel nodded once. That deal almost destroyed me. I stared at him. What Ethan knew, the project had hidden environmental issues before investors were brought in. I felt my pulse quicken. No, I whispered instinctively. Ethan would never. Gabriel held my gaze gently. He did. The certainty in his voice chilled me. I lost nearly $8 million fixing the fallout from that development. I couldn't speak. Because suddenly, pieces of Ethan I had refused to acknowledge for years started aligning into something uglier. The manipulation, the greed, the arrogance. Gabriel continued quietly. I should have walked away from him after that. Why didn't you? A faint smile touched his face. Because you were still married to him. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? Gabriel hesitated. Then he said something that completely caught me off guard. You made Ethan easier to believe in. The words settled into me slowly, painfully, because maybe that had been my role all along. To soften him, humanize him, convince the world and myself that beneath all his ambition, there was still goodness. Gabriel looked at me carefully again. You know he's under financial pressure right now, don't you? I stiffened slightly. What kind of pressure? He didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation told me this conversation had suddenly become something much bigger than nostalgia. Much bigger than my divorce. Gabriel lowered his voice slightly. Chelsea, how much do you actually know about Ethan's current business situation? I stared at him silently, and for the first time since my marriage started collapsing, I realized Ethan Walker might not be nearly as untouchable as he wanted everyone to believe. I barely slept after meeting Gabriel Bennett. His words stayed in my mind long after I returned home. How much do you actually know about Ethan's current business situation? The honest answer was humiliating. Almost nothing. There was a time when I knew every detail of Ethan's business life, every loan, every project, every risk. I used to review contracts beside him at our kitchen table while eating takeout Chinese food at midnight. But over the years, Ethan slowly pushed me further away from that world. At first, it happened subtly. You don't need to worry about this stuff anymore. Then later, you wouldn't understand the newer investment structures. Eventually, just let me handle it. And like a fool, I let him. Not because I wasn't capable, Because I trusted him. That trust now felt like a scar I could touch from the inside. The following morning, I sat alone in the massive kitchen of the house Ethan and I once dreamed of owning. The marble countertops suddenly looked cold instead of luxurious. The enormous windows no longer felt impressive. Everything echoed now. A house becomes very different once love leaves it. I stared at the old leather folder spread across the table in front of me. Original partnership records. Bank approvals tied to my inheritance. Property acquisition contracts from the first building. Every page whispered the same thing. You were never just the wife. For years, Ethan had rewritten history until even I started doubting my role in his success. But paper doesn't lie. My phone buzzed suddenly. A text message from Ethan. We need to keep things civil. Don't let outsiders influence you. Outsiders, meaning Gabriel. The fact that Ethan already knew I had seen him unsettled me. Chicago's wealthy circles really were smaller than most people imagined. I typed nothing back. 10 minutes later, another message appeared. Sophia says she saw you with Bennett yesterday? I stared at the screen. Not I heard, Sophia says. As if she already occupied a permanent place in Ethan's decision-making. I set the phone down without replying again. Then I noticed something strange. For the first time in months, Ethan's silence no longer frightened me. Around noon, my doorbell rang. When I opened the front door, Gabriel stood there holding 2 paper coffee cups. I blinked in surprise. You followed me home. A faint smile crossed his face. You gave me your address 25 years ago. Despite myself, I laughed softly. It felt unfamiliar, like using muscles I hadn't touched in years. Gabriel handed me one of the coffees. I was nearby? That was obviously a lie. But it was a kind lie. And after months of emotional warfare, kindness felt almost shocking. I stepped aside to let him in. Gabriel walked slowly through the house, studying the towering ceilings and expensive artwork with quiet observation. Ethan always liked proving he'd made it, he said gently. There was no bitterness in his voice, just understanding. I led him into the kitchen. You said yesterday that Ethan was under financial pressure. Gabriel nodded once, but didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked at the documents spread across the counter. His expression sharpened slightly. Are these what I think they are? I hesitated. Then nodded. The original partnership documents. Gabriel picked up one page carefully. The moment he saw my signature, his entire expression changed. Chelsea. What? These are extremely important. My pulse quickened slightly. I thought so too. No, he said quietly. You don't understand. He set the paper down gently. If these records are valid and they appear to be Ethan, may have a serious legal problem. I stared at him. The words sounded unreal. Ethan Walker didn't have problems. He caused them, controlled them, manipulated them. Men like Ethan spent their lives making sure consequences happened to other people, not themselves. Gabriel finally sat across from me. Walker Development Group was built through layers of restructuring over the years, he explained carefully. But if the foundation traces back to jointly owned partnership assets funded by your inheritance? He paused. Then your claim could be far larger than Ethan expected. A strange mixture of fear and satisfaction moved through me. Not because I wanted revenge, because for the first time in years I felt visible again. Seen. Real. I don't even know where to start, I admitted quietly. Gabriel looked directly at me. You start by protecting yourself. His voice carried a calm certainty that made me feel safer than I wanted to admit. I wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. Why are you helping me? The question lingered between us longer than expected. Gabriel leaned back slightly. Do you want the polite answer? I want the honest one. A faint smile touched his face. The honest answer is that watching Ethan destroy you makes me angry. I swallowed hard. Why? Because you deserved better. The simplicity of it nearly broke me. No manipulation, no performance, just truth. For almost 30 years, I had adjusted myself constantly to fit Ethan's needs. Softer, smaller, easier, less emotional, less demanding, less visible. And now this man sat across from me speaking as though my pain actually mattered. It felt dangerously comforting. Gabriel reached into his coat pocket and handed me a business card. On the back, he had written a name. Rachel Levin, he said. Best divorce attorney in Chicago. I already have an attorney. You have the attorney Ethan expected you to hire? That sentence stopped me cold. Gabriel continued gently. Chelsea men like Ethan survive because they count on women wanting peace more than fairness. I looked down at the card silently. Rachel Levin. I recognized the name immediately. Aggressive, brilliant, ruthless in court. Exactly the kind of lawyer Ethan would hate. I can't afford someone like her, I said quietly. Gabriel's expression didn't change. Yes, you can. I frowned slightly. You don't understand. Ethan controls almost everything financially? Gabriel looked toward the old documents again. No, he said softly. I think Ethan wanted you to believe that. Silence settled heavily over the kitchen. Then Gabriel said something that made my stomach tighten instantly. There's something else you should know. I looked up. Ethan recently took on significant debt connected to a luxury redevelopment project. The Milwaukee project. Gabriel nodded. He's over-leveraged. I frowned slightly. Ethan's always taken risks. Yes, Gabriel agreed, but this time he expected outside capital to stabilize the project. My chest tightened slowly. You. Gabriel didn't answer immediately, but the silence confirmed it. Ethan hadn't just underestimated me emotionally. He had already financially positioned himself assuming I would quietly accept his settlement and disappear. The realization stunned me. You're saying he already counted on winning. He counted on controlling the narrative, Gabriel corrected gently. That sounded exactly like Ethan. Control the money, control the story, control the woman. I stood slowly and walked toward the large kitchen windows overlooking the snowy backyard. For years, I believed surviving pain quietly made me strong. But maybe strength looked different now. Maybe strength meant finally refusing to disappear. Behind me, Gabriel spoke carefully. There's one more thing. I turned around. He hesitated briefly before continuing. My investment firm recently acquired part of the secondary debt tied to Ethan's redevelopment project. I blinked in surprise. You invested in Ethan's company? No, Gabriel said calmly. I invested in leverage. I stared at him silently, and suddenly I understood. Gabriel Bennett wasn't just a wealthy man who felt sorry for me. He was someone powerful enough to stand across from Ethan without fear, someone Ethan couldn't manipulate, someone who already knew exactly how dangerous my husband could be. Gabriel rose from his chair slowly. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, Chelsea. His voice softened slightly. But I do think you've spent enough years trusting the wrong person. The room fell quiet again. Then he walked toward the front door. Just before leaving, he paused. You know, he said gently, Ethan always believed money made him powerful. I looked at him carefully. Gabriel's eyes held mine steadily. But the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who finally realizes her own value. Then he walked out into the falling snow. And for the first time since my marriage began collapsing, I no longer felt afraid of what came next. 3 weeks later, I stood beneath a crystal chandelier, wearing a black evening gown Ethan had never seen before. And for the first time in years, I wasn't dressing for my husband's approval. I was dressing for myself. The charity gala took place at the Art Institute of Chicago, one of those elite events where wealthy people pretend generosity erases greed. Investors, politicians, developers, and socialites drifted through marble halls holding champagne glasses, while photographers captured smiles worth millions of dollars. I almost declined Gabriel's invitation. Crowds exhausted me lately. Public appearances reminded me too much of the woman I had become beside Ethan, decorative, silent aging carefully under expensive lighting. But Gabriel insisted gently. "You've spent enough time hiding, Chelsea." So I came. And now, standing in front of the enormous museum mirrors while soft piano music floated through the air, I barely recognized myself. Not because I suddenly looked younger, because I looked awake, alive. I had cut my hair slightly shorter the week before. Soft layers framed my face, now silver strands, no longer hidden beneath desperate dye. Rachel Levin, my new attorney, had already filed motions challenging Ethan's settlement structure. And for the first time since the divorce began, I no longer felt like prey. Terrified sometimes, yes, but not powerless. "Chelsea." I turned at the sound of Gabriel's voice. For one embarrassing second, my heart stumbled. He looked devastatingly elegant in a dark tuxedo, silver hair perfectly styled, his calm confidence filling space without demanding attention. Unlike Ethan, Gabriel never entered rooms trying to dominate them. That made him infinitely more powerful. "You look beautiful tonight," he said softly. No exaggerated flattery, no manipulation, just sincerity. I smiled faintly. "Thank you." His eyes lingered on me carefully. "And you look happy." The truth startled me. I think I forgot what that felt like. Gabriel offered me his arm. "Then let's not waste the evening." As we walked into the main ballroom together, conversations subtly shifted around us. People noticed. Of course they did. Chicago's wealthy circles survive on gossip the way fire survives on oxygen. And tonight's gossip was obvious. Ethan Walker's wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, had arrived with Gabriel Bennett. A man wealthier than Ethan. A man more respected than Ethan. A man Ethan deeply disliked. I felt eyes following us immediately, judging, speculating, calculating. For years, those looks would have made me shrink into myself. Tonight, I lifted my chin slightly higher. Gabriel introduced me to several people throughout the evening. Investors, philanthropists, foundation directors. Unlike Ethan, he never spoke over me or reduced me to decoration beside him. He listened when I talked, included me naturally. At one point during dinner, an older woman beside me smiled warmly. "I've heard wonderful things about you, Chelsea." I almost laughed. Wonderful things. Not poor Chelsea. Not Ethan's discarded wife, just Chelsea. The strange thing about emotional neglect is that you stop realizing how starved you are until someone finally treats you kindly again. Halfway through the evening, Gabriel stepped away briefly to speak with another investor. I wandered toward the balcony overlooking Michigan Avenue, needing air. Snow drifted softly across the city below. Chicago looked beautiful at night. Lonely too. "You seem very comfortable here." The voice behind me instantly tightened every muscle in my body. "Ethan." I turned slowly. He stood near the balcony entrance, wearing a charcoal tuxedo, one hand tucked casually into his pocket. Sophia stood beside him in a silver gown that looked expensive enough to pay someone's mortgage. But it wasn't Sophia who caught my attention. It was Ethan's face. Anger, confusion. something almost wounded beneath both. His eyes moved over me slowly. "You clean up well," he said. I recognized the insult buried beneath the compliment immediately. Sophia smiled sweetly beside him. "Chelsea, you look amazing. Honestly." Again with the fake kindness. I smiled politely. "Thank you." Ethan stepped closer. So he said casually, "You and Gabriel Bennett now." The possessiveness in his tone irritated me instantly. "We're attending a charity event." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "Right." Sophia slipped her arm through his possessively. "We were just surprised to see you here together." That was the moment I understood something important. They weren't surprised. They were nervous. I looked directly at Ethan. Why? For a second, he didn't answer. Then Sophia spoke too quickly. "Gabriel's a very influential man." There it was. Not jealousy, fear. Before I could respond, Gabriel returned calmly beside me. His posture remained relaxed, but I noticed the subtle shift in his expression the moment he saw Ethan standing too close to me. Ethan, Gabriel said smoothly, "Bennett." The tension between them was immediate. Cold, old, dangerous. Sophia attempted a bright smile. "We were just saying how nice it is to see Chelsea getting out more." Gabriel's eyes flicked toward her briefly. "I imagine that's difficult for some people." Sophia's smile tightened. Ethan ignored the comment entirely. Instead, he looked directly at Gabriel. "I heard your firm recently acquired secondary debt positions connected to Milwaukee." Silence. Ah, so now we were finally speaking honestly. Gabriel adjusted his cufflink calmly. "We make many investments." Ethan's jaw flexed slightly. "That project's under my company, for now." The words landed like a blade. Even Sophia went still. I stared at Gabriel in surprise. He had never spoken this directly about Ethan's business before. Ethan's voice lowered dangerously. "You trying to make some kind of point?" Gabriel met his gaze without blinking. "No, I think reality is making the point for me." The air between them suddenly felt electric. Around us, guests continued laughing and drinking, completely unaware that a silent war was unfolding 3 feet away. Ethan turned toward me abruptly. "You know what this is really about?" I frowned slightly. "What he's using you." Gabriel didn't react. But I did, because hearing Ethan accuse another man of manipulation felt almost absurd. I crossed my arms slowly. "You don't get to decide who values me anymore." That sentence hit him harder than I expected. I saw it immediately in his eyes. For years, Ethan controlled every emotional atmosphere around me. If he withdrew affection, I panicked. If he criticized me, I adjusted myself. If he ignored me, I tried harder. But now he couldn't reach me the same way anymore, and it terrified him. Sophia stepped in quickly, clearly sensing Ethan losing control. "Ethan, maybe we should head back inside." But Ethan barely heard her. His attention stayed fixed on Gabriel. "How much debt did you buy?" Gabriel smiled faintly. "Enough." That single word visibly rattled Ethan. For the first time since our divorce started, I saw something unfamiliar in my husband's face. Uncertainty. Not arrogance. Not superiority. Fear. A voice suddenly echoed through the ballroom speakers announcing the evening's primary donor recognition ceremony. The crowd began gathering near the stage. Sophia touched Ethan's arm again. "Come on." But before leaving, Ethan looked at me one last time, and I realized something startling. He no longer looked at me like I was replaceable. He looked at me like I had become dangerous. Gabriel waited until Ethan and Sophia disappeared into the crowd before speaking again. "You okay?" I let out a slow breath. I think my ex-husband is panicking. A faint smile crossed Gabriel's face. Good. I looked at him carefully. What exactly did you do? Gabriel glanced toward the ballroom where Ethan stood rigid near the stage. Then he answered quietly. I bought the leverage he thought nobody else would notice. My pulse quickened slightly. And what happens now? Gabriel looked directly into my eyes. Now Ethan learns what it feels like when someone else controls the room. The cracks in Ethan and Sophia's relationship started showing almost immediately after the gala. Not publicly, of course. People like them never unravel in public first. They unravel in whispers, in late-night arguments behind penthouse walls, in tension hidden beneath designer clothes and fake smiles. And somehow, without trying, I became the person watching it happen from the outside. 3 days after the charity event, Rachel Levin called me just after breakfast. You need to see this, she said without greeting. Something in her tone instantly tightened my stomach. An hour later, I sat across from her in her downtown office while she slid several printed financial records toward me. These transfers happened within the last 6 weeks, Rachel explained. I scanned the documents slowly. Luxury purchases, wire transfers, asset movement, large ones. What am I looking at? Rachel folded her hands carefully. Your husband is moving money aggressively. I frowned. Trying to hide assets? Possibly, but that's not the interesting part. She pointed toward one series of transactions. Most were connected to accounts I recognized from Ethan's business holdings, but one name kept appearing repeatedly. Sophia Reed. My chest tightened instantly. What exactly is he transferring to her? Rachel's expression darkened slightly. Cash gifts, jewelry purchases, property deposits, insurance modifications. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. Ethan wasn't just having an affair. He was restructuring his life around her, like a teenager trying to impress a woman who still believed he was powerful. Rachel leaned back slightly. In my experience, men behave irrationally when they're afraid of aging. The sentence lingered heavily in the room, because deep down, I knew that was exactly what this had become. Ethan didn't just want Sophia. He wanted what she represented. Youth, admiration, validation. Proof that he was still desirable, still important, still in control. Rachel tapped another page. This is what concerns me most. I looked down again. A pending purchase agreement for a penthouse condo overlooking Lake Michigan. The buyer wasn't Ethan. It was Sophia. But the funding source traced back to Ethan's holding company. I let out a slow breath. He's buying her property during our divorce? Rachel nodded once, which a judge may not appreciate. For the first time in weeks, anger flared hotter than grief inside me. Not because Ethan loved someone else, because he was treating the life we built together like disposable income for his midlife crisis. Rachel studied me carefully. How are you holding up emotionally? The question surprised me. Most people lately only asked about the divorce strategically, financially, legally. But emotionally, nobody really wanted the answer to that. I looked out her office window toward the Chicago skyline. Some days, I feel relieved, I admitted quietly. Other days, I feel humiliated. Rachel nodded knowingly. That's normal? No, I said softly. What's humiliating is realizing how long I allowed someone to slowly erase me. Her voice remained calm. Chelsea, emotionally manipulative men don't erase women all at once. They do it gradually, small cuts over years. That sentence sat with me long after I left her office. Because she was right. Ethan hadn't destroyed my confidence overnight. He had done it patiently, carefully, until I no longer recognized myself. That evening, Gabriel invited me to dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant near the river. Unlike Ethan, Gabriel never chose restaurants for attention. No photographers, no power tables, no performance, just warmth. Candles flickered softly between us while snow drifted outside the windows again. Chicago winters always seemed endless. Gabriel listened quietly while I explained the financial transfers Rachel uncovered. When I finished, he sighed softly. Sophia's accelerating things. What do you mean she knows Ethan's vulnerable? I frowned slightly. You think she actually cares about him at all? Gabriel's expression said everything before he answered. No. The simplicity of it felt brutal. I looked down at my wine glass. I almost feel sorry for him. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. Do you? I thought about that carefully. Did I? Maybe part of me did. Not for the man Ethan had become, but for the younger version of him I once loved. The ambitious dreamer from our tiny apartment years ago. The man who used to dance with me in the kitchen while bills piled up on the counter. But that man felt very far away now. He's destroying himself, I said quietly. Gabriel's eyes held mine steadily. No Chelsea. Ethan's revealing himself. That distinction hit me hard. Because maybe Ethan hadn't changed as much as I wanted to believe. Maybe success simply removed the need for him to pretend anymore. Halfway through dinner, Gabriel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen briefly, then set it face down again. But I noticed the subtle shift in his expression. What is it? He hesitated, then sighed. One of my analysts, about Ethan. Gabriel nodded once. My stomach tightened immediately. What happened? Walker Development Group is facing liquidity pressure faster than expected. I blinked. That serious Gabriel leaned back carefully. Ethan structured several major projects, assuming refinancing would stabilize them this quarter. And lenders are getting nervous. The words settled heavily between us. I suddenly remembered Ethan's constant stress during the final year of our marriage. The late-night phone calls, the drinking, the sudden bursts of anger. At the time, I thought he was emotionally pulling away because of Sophia. Now I wondered how much of it was financial panic. Gabriel studied me carefully. You didn't know how bad things were, did you? I shook my head slowly. He hid everything from me. Because if you knew the truth, Gabriel said quietly, you would have had leverage. Leverage. That word again. It seemed to define everything now. Money, marriage, power, control. When dinner ended, Gabriel walked me outside to the valet area. Cold wind swept through the streets while headlights reflected across wet pavement. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Gabriel looked at me carefully. You know what Ethan fears most right now? What losing the image of himself. I frowned slightly. More than money, yes. Gabriel's voice remained calm. Men like Ethan build identities around being admired. Wealth is only part of it. Control matters more. I thought about that all the way home, and later that night, I received proof he was right. Around midnight, my phone rang unexpectedly. Ethan. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. What his breathing sounded uneven immediately. Where are you? I frowned. At home, with Bennett. The jealousy in his voice startled me. No. Silence. Then Ethan exhaled sharply. You're making a mistake with him. I almost laughed. The audacity, after everything. You lost the right to advise me about mistakes. Chelsea, no. You don't get to call me at midnight acting concerned after humiliating me for months. His voice hardened instantly. You think Bennett actually cares about you? There it was. Not concern. Possession. Fear. I lowered my voice carefully. You know what's interesting, Ethan? Silence. Gabriel talks to me like I matter. That sentence hit him hard enough I could hear the pause on the line. Then his tone changed completely. Cold again. dangerously cold. You have no idea what you're getting involved in. Before I could answer, another voice suddenly echoed faintly through the phone. Female, annoyed. Ethan, are you coming back to bed or not, Sophia? I closed my eyes briefly. The humiliation no longer hurt the way it once did. Now it just made me tired. You should go, I said quietly. Chelsea. I hung up, then I sat alone in the dark living room staring at the city lights outside. And for the first time since our marriage started collapsing, I realized something terrifying. Ethan wasn't calling because he loved me. He was calling because he was losing control of me. And men like Ethan never panic until control starts slipping away. The storage room smelled like dust cardboard and forgotten years. I stood alone beneath the dim overhead light, wearing old jeans and gloves, while snow hammered softly against the garage windows outside. Around me sat decades of my life packed into boxes Ethan probably assumed I would never open again. Christmas decorations, photo albums, old tax records. Memories nobody values until they become evidence. For 3 straight days, I searched through everything. Every folder, every envelope, every file cabinet drawer. Rachel Levin had become almost obsessive after reviewing the original partnership documents. There's more here, she kept insisting. I can feel it. And somehow I could too. The deeper I dug into the past, the more I realized how carefully Ethan had rewritten our history over the years. Not suddenly, strategically, piece by piece, removing my fingerprints from his success until even I started questioning whether they were ever there at all. But paper tells the truth people try to bury, and buried truth is still truth. I opened another box labeled Old Financials in faded black marker. Inside sat stacks of paperwork tied together with rubber bands brittle from age. I almost ignored it. Then I noticed my father's handwriting on one envelope. My chest tightened instantly. My father died 26 years ago, but seeing his writing still had the power to make me feel like a little girl again. I sat down slowly on the cold concrete floor and opened the envelope carefully. Inside were copies of bank correspondence tied to the very first building Ethan and I purchased together. Loan approvals, equity agreements, funding structures, then something else, a notarized partnership amendment. I froze. My pulse began pounding so hard I could hear it. Slowly, I unfolded the final page, and there it was, the missing piece. Walker Morales Property Partnership, not Walker Development Group, not Ethan Walker Enterprises. Walker Morales, my name, equal ownership percentages. My inheritance listed explicitly as originating capital, and most importantly, a clause stating that all future expansion projects tied to the initial partnership could legally trace proportional ownership back to original equity contributors unless formally dissolved in writing. I stopped breathing for a second, because I knew immediately what that meant. Ethan never dissolved the original structure properly. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Rachel immediately. She answered on the second ring. Tell me you found something. I think I found everything. An hour later, Rachel sat beside me in the storage room surrounded by opened boxes and scattered documents. She read the partnership amendment 3 times without speaking. Then she slowly removed her glasses. Oh my God! The words barely came out above a whisper. What I asked, nervously. Rachel looked at me like she couldn't believe what she was holding. Chelsea. Ethan is in serious trouble. A strange wave of nausea hit me. Not satisfaction, shock. Because despite everything Ethan had done, part of me still struggled to accept that the man I once loved might have spent decades deliberately pushing me out of ownership connected to assets I legally helped create. Rachel spread several pages across the floor. If these records hold up, and I believe they will, Ethan's attorneys either completely overlooked this structure or hoped you'd never rediscover it. I stared at the paperwork silently. My father had saved me without even realizing it. Before he died, he used to make copies of everything. Never trust memory over documentation, he always said. Back then, I thought he was simply organized. Now I understood. He had spent his entire life working around businessmen who smiled while hiding knives. Rachel pointed toward another page. This is even bigger. I leaned closer. The original partnership connected directly to later refinancing structures tied to Ethan's expansion years, including several current developments, including Milwaukee. My stomach dropped. That's impossible. No, Rachel said quietly. It's negligence, or arrogance, because Ethan never imagined I would fight back hard enough to uncover this. Rachel sat back slowly. We need to file emergency motions immediately. I looked at her carefully. What happens if we do? She hesitated, then answered honestly. Worst-case scenario for Ethan, a judge could determine substantial portions of Walker Development Group trace back to jointly owned foundational assets. The room suddenly felt smaller. For years, Ethan treated me like a sentimental accessory to his empire. But legally, I may have been tied to the foundation of that empire itself. I let out a slow breath. He's going to lose his mind. Rachel gave a cold smile. Good. That night I barely slept again. Not from fear this time. From realization. My entire marriage replayed inside my head differently now. Every time Ethan dismissed me. Every time he excluded me from financial conversations. Every time he told me I wouldn't understand. It wasn't just arrogance. It was protection. He needed me emotionally dependent and financially uninformed. Because if I ever fully understood my legal position, his control disappeared. The next morning, I met Gabriel for breakfast at a quiet hotel restaurant near the river. The moment he saw my face, he knew something had happened. You found something. I slid copies of the documents across the table silently. Gabriel studied them carefully, and for the first time since I'd reconnected with him, I saw genuine shock break through his calm exterior. Well, he said finally. That bad. He looked directly at me. That good. I almost laughed nervously. Gabriel leaned back slowly while processing everything. Ethan's entire expansion strategy relied on the assumption that foundational ownership issues were long buried. He buried me with them. Yes, Gabriel said quietly. He did. The truth hurt less now. Not because it mattered less, because clarity removes confusion. And confusion is where manipulators survive. A waiter approached with coffee refills. Neither of us touched them. Finally, Gabriel lowered his voice slightly. Chelsea, there's something you need to prepare for. What? When Ethan realizes what you found, he's going to panic. I frowned slightly. Good. Gabriel shook his head once. No, panicked men with money are dangerous. The seriousness in his tone unsettled me immediately. He wouldn't hurt me. Gabriel held my gaze carefully. I'm not talking about physical harm. A cold feeling moved through me. He'll try to destroy your credibility, Gabriel continued. Your stability, your confidence. Ethan's entire identity depends on staying in control. I stared down at my coffee cup, and if he loses control, Gabriel's expression hardened slightly. Then people finally see who he really is? That afternoon, Ethan called me 12 times. I ignored every one. Then came the texts. We need to talk. Rachel Levin is making this uglier than necessary. You're being manipulated. And finally, you have no idea what you're doing. That last message made me strangely calm. Because for years, Ethan spoke to me like I was fragile, confused, dependent. Now suddenly I was dangerous enough to frighten him. By evening, Rachel called again. We officially filed. I stood frozen in my kitchen, and Ethan's legal team requested emergency postponement within 20 minutes. I almost smiled. 20 minutes, meaning Ethan had likely exploded the moment he saw the filing. Rachel's tone sharpened slightly. There's more. What we received notice this afternoon that Walker Development Group's lenders are requesting additional internal audits tied to ownership exposure. I blinked slowly. That fast, Chelsea, Rachel said carefully. Once financial institutions smell instability, everything moves quickly. I walked toward the windows overlooking the dark backyard. Snow continued falling softly outside. Quiet, beautiful, dangerous underneath. What happens now? I whispered. Rachel didn't hesitate. Now Ethan Walker realizes the woman he called replaceable may own more of his empire than he does. After we hung up, I stood there alone for a long time. Not celebrating, not crying, just breathing. Because something inside me had finally shifted completely. For years I mourned the loss of my marriage. But now, I was mourning something far more painful. The realization that I had spent decades begging for respect from a man who quietly built his power using pieces of me. And somewhere across Chicago tonight, Ethan Walker was finally beginning to understand that I was no longer the woman willing to disappear for him. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River 40 floors above the city. At night, the water reflected gold and silver from surrounding skyscrapers, turning the entire skyline into something almost unreal. Years ago, Ethan used to bring me to places like this when he wanted to celebrate a successful deal. Back then, fancy dinners felt romantic. Now they felt like battlegrounds with expensive lighting. Gabriel sat across from me near the window, calm as always, while a pianist played softly somewhere behind us. Around us, wealthy couples laughed over wine and seafood towers, pretending life was stable and beautiful. Meanwhile, my divorce had become front-page gossip in Chicago business circles. I could feel it in the occasional glances. The recognition, the curiosity, the silent questions. Is that Ethan Walker's wife was? Not anymore. You seem nervous, Gabriel observed gently. I exhaled softly. I'm still getting used to all of this, all of what I looked around the elegant restaurant, the attention, the rumors, being seen. Gabriel's eyes softened slightly. You spent years being invisible beside the wrong man. That sentence settled quietly inside me. Not painful anymore. Just true. A waiter poured more wine into my glass, while Gabriel studied me carefully. You know, he said you don't have to prove anything to anyone tonight. I gave him a faint smile. I think part of me still feels embarrassed about what that people are talking about me like I'm some pathetic older wife replaced by a younger woman. Gabriel's expression hardened immediately. Anyone who sees you that way is blind. Before I could respond, a familiar voice sliced through the restaurant behind me. Well, this is unexpected. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. Ethan. I turned slowly. He stood beside Sophia near the hostess station, both dressed like they had stepped out of a luxury magazine advertisement. But something about Ethan looked different tonight. Sharper, tighter. His confidence no longer appeared effortless. Sophia noticed me first. Or rather, she noticed Gabriel. And the moment she did, her smile changed. Careful. Measured. Like she suddenly understood this wasn't just a social outing anymore. This was power. Chelsea, Ethan said, approaching our table. Fancy seeing you here. Gabriel remained seated calmly. Ethan. The tension between the two men was immediate enough to cut through marble. Sophia touched Ethan's arm lightly. Maybe we should let them enjoy dinner? But Ethan ignored her completely. His attention stayed fixed on me. "You've been busy lately." I held his gaze steadily. "So have you." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Because I wasn't shrinking anymore. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't trying to calm him down. For years, Ethan controlled every emotional atmosphere around us by expecting me to soften discomfort before it escalated. Now, he had to sit inside his own tension, and he hated it. Sophia finally smiled at me directly. "You look really good, Chelsea." Again, with the fake sweetness. I smiled politely. "Thank you." Then her eyes drifted toward Gabriel. "We didn't realize you two had become so close," Gabriel answered before I could. "We enjoy each other's company. Simple, direct, confident." I watched Ethan's jaw tighten almost immediately. Jealousy radiated off him now, though I wasn't sure whether it was emotional or strategic. Probably both. Ethan finally looked at Gabriel coldly. "You're involving yourself in personal matters that don't concern you." Gabriel remained perfectly calm. "Your financial instability concerns anyone attached to your developments." The words landed heavily. Even Sophia went still. A nearby couple glanced toward our table briefly before pretending not to listen. Ethan lowered his voice dangerously. "You think buying secondary debt gives you leverage over me?" Gabriel's expression didn't change. "No. Your decisions gave me leverage over you." Silence. God. I had never seen Ethan unable to dominate a conversation before. And suddenly, I understood something important. Gabriel wasn't afraid of him. Most people around Ethan spent years adapting themselves emotionally to his moods, his ego, his money, his approval. Gabriel simply didn't care. Sophia sat down suddenly beside Ethan without invitation, crossing her legs elegantly. "Well," she said lightly, "business sounds exhausting tonight." I recognized the move immediately. Distraction, deflection. But Gabriel ignored it. Instead, he turned toward Ethan. "How are the lenders handling the audit requests?" The color drained slightly from Ethan's face before he recovered. "Temporary complications." Gabriel tilted his head calmly. "Interesting description." I looked between them carefully. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. And suddenly, I realized something almost shocking. He was rattled, not irritated, not arrogant, afraid. Sophia noticed it too. I could tell from the way her posture subtly shifted away from him. Tiny, almost invisible, but real, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. Sophia Reed wasn't loyal to Ethan. She was loyal to security, money, status, power. And if Ethan stopped representing those things, she would disappear. The realization made me unexpectedly sad. Not for Sophia, for Ethan. Because after destroying nearly 30 years of marriage chasing youth and admiration, he still hadn't recognized the difference between being desired and being loved. A waiter approached awkwardly. "Would anyone care for another bottle?" No, Ethan snapped too quickly. The waiter nearly fled. Gabriel calmly resumed his wine. "You seem tense tonight." Ethan laughed bitterly. "You'd enjoy that, wouldn't you?" Gabriel's answer came quietly. "No, I would have preferred you become a better man years ago." That sentence stunned even me. Sophia shifted uncomfortably. Ethan stared at Gabriel coldly. "You always thought you were morally superior." "No," Gabriel said, "just accountable." The silence afterward felt endless. Then Ethan suddenly turned toward me. "Chelsea, can we talk privately for a minute?" Every instinct inside me tightened. Old instincts. The ones trained over decades to respond immediately when Ethan wanted something. But now I paused. And in that pause, I saw it, the panic in his eyes. Small, barely visible, but unmistakable. I set my napkin down slowly. You can say whatever you need to say here. Ethan's jaw flexed hard. This isn't the place. Then maybe you should have treated me better when you still had access to private conversations? Sophia looked away immediately. Even she seemed uncomfortable now. For one brief second, genuine anger flashed across Ethan's face. Not sadness, not regret. Anger that he could no longer control me. You think Bennett's going to save you? He asked coldly. I almost smiled, because there it was again. Ethan still believed women existed through men, protected by them, defined by them, owned by them. I leaned back slowly. No, Ethan. I think I'm finally saving myself. That sentence hit harder than anything else I could have said. I saw it instantly. Because suddenly, Ethan looked at me differently. Not like the emotional wife he could manipulate. Not like the aging woman he replaced. Like an opponent. Sophia stood abruptly. Ethan, we should go. This time he listened. But before leaving, he looked directly at Gabriel. You think this ends well for you? Gabriel met his stare without blinking. I think truth usually ends badly for people who spent years hiding from it. Then Ethan looked at me one final time. And for the first time since our marriage collapsed, I saw something in his expression I never expected. Regret. Not enough to change him, but enough to haunt him. He and Sophia walked away together through the crowded restaurant. Yet, even from behind, I could see distance already growing between them. Tiny cracks, hairline fractures, the beginning of collapse. Gabriel waited until they disappeared before speaking again. You handled that well. I stared down at the city lights below us. No, I said quietly. What I survived it well, because there's a difference. Strength doesn't always feel powerful in the moment. Sometimes it just feels like refusing to disappear. I turned toward Gabriel carefully. Do you know what's strange? What a few months ago seeing Ethan with another woman would have destroyed me? Gabriel listened silently. But tonight, I swallowed softly. Tonight, I just felt tired for him. Gabriel studied me for several seconds before answering. That's how healing begins, Chelsea. Outside the windows, snow continued falling over Chicago. And somewhere beneath those lights, Ethan Walker was slowly learning something terrifying. The woman he called replaceable no longer needed his approval to survive. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper coffee and tension. By the time Rachel Levin and I walked into the hearing room that morning, nearly every seat behind Ethan's legal team was already filled. Not with family, not with friends, with observers, financial analysts, junior attorneys, reporters pretending they weren't reporters. In Chicago, wealthy divorces become public entertainment the moment money and scandal collide hard enough. And Ethan Walker's empire was beginning to crack publicly. I sat beside Rachel quietly while Ethan entered through the side doors with two attorneys trailing behind him. Sophia wasn't there. That alone told me everything. 3 months ago, she would have been glued to his side. Now she was disappearing whenever things looked difficult. Ethan looked older than I remembered. Not physically older. Emotionally worn. The confidence he used to wear like armor had developed fractures. Tiny ones, but visible. For one brief moment his eyes met mine across the courtroom, and something twisted painfully inside my chest. Because despite everything, I still remembered the man I once loved hidden somewhere beneath this stranger. That was the cruel thing about long marriages. Even after betrayal, memories continue fighting against reality. Rachel leaned closer to me. Don't soften now. I looked at her carefully. I'm trying not to. You're not responsible for protecting him anymore. The sentence settled heavily inside me. Because for almost 30 years, protecting Ethan had become instinct. Protecting his reputation, his ego, his stress, his image. Even from consequences he deserved. The judge entered promptly at 9. Within minutes, the hearing began. Rachel stood first, and as she calmly presented the partnership documents tied to my inheritance and the original Walker-Morales property partnership, I watched the atmosphere in the room slowly change. At first, Ethan's attorneys looked irritated, then uncomfortable, then alarmed. Rachel moved carefully through every document with brutal precision. The foundational assets used to create subsequent development structures originated through jointly held partnership equity, she explained clearly. Mrs. Morales contributed direct inheritance capital and retained contractual ownership interests that were never legally dissolved. The judge adjusted his glasses slowly while reviewing the paperwork. Ethan stared forward rigidly. For years, he built an entire empire, assuming I would never rediscover the truth. Now that truth sat under courtroom lights for everyone to see. Rachel continued. In addition, financial restructuring over multiple decades appears to have excluded Mrs. Morales from ownership disclosures tied to expansion assets legally connected to the original partnership. That sentence hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Even I felt my stomach tighten hearing it spoken aloud. Because stripped of legal language, it meant something simple. Ethan may have spent years quietly pushing me out of assets I legally helped build. One of Ethan's attorneys rose immediately. Your Honor, we strongly dispute the interpretation being presented here. Rachel didn't even blink. Then perhaps Mr. Walker can explain why the partnership was never formally dissolved despite benefiting from continuing expansion financing. Silence. The judge turned toward Ethan. Mr. Walker, and for the first time since our divorce started, Ethan looked cornered. He cleared his throat. The business evolved significantly over the years. Rachel spoke immediately. Businesses evolving does not erase ownership obligations. Ethan's jaw tightened. I watched him carefully. For decades, Ethan controlled rooms effortlessly. He charmed investors, negotiated deals, manipulated narratives. He always knew exactly how to position himself as the smartest person present. But now the facts existed outside his control. And facts are dangerous to men who survive on image. Rachel presented another series of documents tied to financial transfers. Hidden asset movement. Luxury purchases connected to Sophia. Questionable restructuring during active divorce proceedings. The judge's expression darkened visibly. Then came the moment that changed everything. Rachel placed one final document before the court, a transfer authorization bearing Ethan's signature. And directly beneath it, a forged amendment referencing my removal from certain ownership pathways years earlier. My pulse stopped. I had never seen that document before. Rachel's voice remained ice cold. We believe this amendment may contain fraudulent execution irregularities. The courtroom exploded with murmurs immediately. Ethan's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, but the judge interrupted sharply. Sit down. Even Ethan looked stunned now. Not performatively stunned, genuinely. Because suddenly I understood something horrifying. This wasn't just greed anymore. Somewhere over the years, Ethan had crossed legal lines to protect his control. The judge reviewed the paperwork for a long moment before speaking carefully. I am ordering a full forensic accounting review tied to all foundational partnership structures and associated asset transfers. The room went dead silent. A forensic review. In Ethan's world, that was catastrophic. Not just financially, socially, professionally, publicly. I looked toward Ethan instinctively, And for the first time in our entire marriage, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. Not anger, not irritation. Fear. The hearing recessed briefly afterward while attorneys reorganized paperwork. As people filtered around the courtroom whispering, Ethan suddenly approached me. Rachel immediately stiffened beside me, but Ethan ignored her. His voice dropped low. "What exactly are you trying to do?" I stared at him carefully. "You mean, besides protecting myself, you know this could destroy the company." I almost laughed from disbelief. Destroy the company. Not destroy us. Not destroy our marriage. Not destroy me. The company, always the company. I stood slowly. "You destroyed this, Ethan. Not me." His expression hardened instantly. "You're letting Rachel and Bennett manipulate you." There it was again. The same old instinct. Convince me I couldn't think for myself. I crossed my arms. No, I'm finally listening to myself. His eyes searched mine desperately now. "Chelsea, you don't understand how complicated this is." The sentence triggered something inside me immediately. Because for years, Ethan used those exact words whenever he wanted me excluded from financial conversations. Complicated. Translation. Stay quiet, trust me blindly, don't ask questions. I stepped closer. "You know what's interesting?" I asked softly. Ethan frowned slightly. "You spent years making me feel small, so I'd never realize how much of your world depended on me." The truth of that sentence visibly hit him. Hard. Because suddenly, Ethan wasn't standing across from the obedient wife he spent decades diminishing. He was standing across from the woman who finally understood her own value. For one dangerous second, emotion cracked through his mask completely. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. I stared at him in disbelief. "You called me replaceable." Pain flashed across his face instantly, and somehow that hurt him more than any legal filing ever could. Ethan looked away briefly before speaking again. I was angry. "No," I said softly. "You were honest." The silence between us felt enormous, heavy with 28 years of unresolved truth. Then Ethan whispered something I never expected to hear. "I didn't think you'd fight back." God, that sentence, that one sentence explained our entire marriage. Because Ethan truly believed my love for him would always outweigh my love for myself. And for many years, it had, but not anymore. Rachel stepped beside me calmly. "We're done here." Ethan looked at me one final time before returning to his attorneys, and as I watched him walk away, I realized something devastating. For years, I thought Ethan's greatest betrayal was cheating on me with Sophia. But it wasn't. His greatest betrayal was believing I would quietly disappear after helping him build everything. The hearing ended shortly afterward. Outside the courthouse, reporters already crowded the sidewalks. Cameras flashed instantly the moment Ethan emerged. Questions exploded around him. "Mr. Walker, are allegations of fraudulent restructuring true? Did your company illegally conceal marital ownership assets? Is Walker Development Group under investigation?" Ethan pushed through the crowd without answering. And suddenly, I saw it clearly. The powerful man who once controlled every room he entered was no longer managing the narrative. The truth was, Rachel touched my arm gently. "You okay?" I looked up at the gray Chicago sky. For the first time in years, breathing felt easier. Not because the pain was gone, because I finally understood something important. Justice doesn't always begin with revenge. Sometimes it begins the moment a woman stops agreeing to disappear. Sophia Reed disappeared 3 days after the courthouse hearing. Not dramatically, not with screaming arguments or shattered glass like the movies, just quietly. efficiently. Like someone leaving a hotel room they never intended to stay in permanently. I found out because Ethan called me at 6:30 in the morning, sounding like a man standing inside the ruins of his own life. At first, I almost didn't recognize his voice. It lacked the sharp arrogance that had defined him for years. Chelsea. I sat up slowly in bed, confused. The city outside my bedroom window still looked dark and frozen beneath early morning snow. What happened? Silence. Then a bitter laugh escaped him. She emptied the accounts. For a moment, I didn't understand. Who? Another hollow laugh. Sophia? I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she did. She took everything she could access, Ethan continued. Cash transfers, jewelry, the penthouse deposit, even the offshore discretionary accounts she knew about. His breathing sounded uneven, panicked, and suddenly, the powerful man who once controlled investors' attorneys and entire city blocks sounded like someone drowning. Part of me should have felt victorious. Maybe a younger version of me would have. But mostly, I just felt tired. What did you expect? I asked quietly. The silence on the other end lasted too long. Finally, Ethan whispered something so broken, it barely sounded like him. I thought she loved me. God. That sentence hurt in ways I didn't expect. Not because I still wanted him, because I remembered being the woman who once believed the exact same thing about him. I have to go, I said softly. Chelsea, wait. I hesitated. Then Ethan spoke again. I don't know who else to call. The words settled heavily into my chest. For almost 30 years, I had been the person Ethan called when things collapsed. Business crises, financial stress, family emergencies, emotional disasters. I had spent decades stabilizing him while slowly disappearing myself. And now, after humiliating me publicly, betraying me privately, and calling me replaceable, he still reached for me instinctively. Not Sophia, not his attorneys. Me. I swallowed hard. You should call your lawyer. Then I hung up. My hands trembled afterward. Not from regret, from grief. Because there's something devastating about realizing the person who hurt you most still feels emotionally familiar. That afternoon, Gabriel came over carrying groceries after I casually mentioned during a phone call that I hadn't eaten much lately. The gesture was so unexpectedly thoughtful it nearly undid me. You didn't have to do this, I said softly, while he unpacked bags in my kitchen. You spent 30 years taking care of someone else, Gabriel replied calmly. Maybe let somebody take care of you once in a while. I looked away quickly before emotion overwhelmed me. Gabriel noticed immediately. You talked to Ethan. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. He sounded terrible. Gabriel leaned against the counter quietly. He probably is. I wrapped my arms around myself. Sophia left him. Gabriel didn't seem surprised. No. She took money. That part surprises me even less. I almost smiled faintly. Then my expression faded again. He sounded lost. Gabriel watched me carefully for several seconds before speaking. Chelsea, compassion doesn't mean you owe him your life again. The sentence hit directly where it needed to, because deep down part of me already felt guilty for not comforting Ethan, even now, even after everything. Gabriel continued gently. You spent decades being emotionally trained to rescue him. I sat slowly at the kitchen island. That's exactly what it feels like. Because that's exactly what happened. His voice remained calm, not judgmental, just honest. And honesty had become strangely healing lately. Later that evening, Rachel called with more updates from the forensic review. The situation around Walker Development Group had deteriorated rapidly. Lenders were freezing portions of Ethan's refinancing access. 2 investors had withdrawn from the Milwaukee project. Several internal audits uncovered irregular transfers connected to Sophia. And perhaps worst of all for Ethan, business publications were starting to question his leadership publicly. Reputation. That was always Ethan's real addiction. Not money, admiration, control. The image of being untouchable. Now that image was collapsing in front of everyone. "Do you think he'll recover?" I asked quietly. Rachel paused. "Financially? Maybe eventually. And emotionally." Rachel's voice softened slightly. "Men like Ethan rarely know who they are without power." After we hung up, I wandered through the house alone. The same house I once begged Ethan to spend more time inside. Funny how empty places become once you stop trying to fill them with hope. Near midnight, my phone buzzed again. Ethan. This time, I let it ring twice before answering. "What?" The background noise told me immediately he wasn't home. Muted jazz music. Ice clinking in glasses. "A bar. I'm at the Drake," he said quietly. I closed my eyes. The Drake Hotel. One of Ethan's favorite places back when life still felt glamorous. "What do you want?" A long silence followed. Then, "Do you remember our first anniversary?" The question caught me completely off guard. "What, our first anniversary?" he repeated softly. "We stayed at the Drake because we couldn't afford anything else expensive yet. We split one dessert because we were broke." I stared out into the dark kitchen silently. Of course I remembered. I remembered everything. That was the curse of loving deeply. You become an archive of moments the other person eventually forgets. Ethan laughed weakly under his breath. "You wore that green dress." My throat tightened painfully. "Yes. You looked beautiful." I leaned against the counter slowly. Why now? Why did men always become sentimental only after destruction arrived? "I used to think we'd survive anything," Ethan admitted quietly. I swallowed hard. So did I. The sadness in his breathing almost sounded unbearable now. "She left me this morning." I closed my eyes again. "I know." "No," he whispered. "You don't understand." Maybe he was right. Because despite everything Ethan had done to me, I still had never experienced what it felt like to realize someone only loved what you could provide. But Ethan had. Now. Finally. "She didn't even argue," he said bitterly. "She just packed her things and walked out." The irony settled heavily between us both. Because that was exactly what Ethan once did emotionally to me. Left quietly, detached slowly, withdrew love piece by piece until abandonment became complete, long before the relationship officially ended. I kept asking her why he continued softly, and she looked at me like I was stupid. Pain moved through my chest unexpectedly. Not romantic pain, human pain. Because no matter how flawed Ethan became, I once loved this man enough to build my entire future around him. And hearing him shattered still hurt somewhere deep inside me. Then Ethan whispered something that finally broke whatever illusion remained between us. She said I wasn't useful anymore. I stopped breathing for a second. Useful. Not loved. Useful. The word echoed through me with terrible familiarity. Because suddenly, I understood. Sophia had done to Ethan exactly what Ethan did to me. Reduced a human being to value, to usefulness, to replaceability. The silence stretched endlessly. Then Ethan asked quietly, "Is this how I made you feel?" Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Not because I wanted revenge, because after all these years, he finally understood. "Yes," I whispered. Complete silence. Then I heard it. Not anger, not manipulation, not performance. A grown man crying quietly alone in a hotel bar. And somehow that sound felt more tragic than satisfying. After a long time, Ethan finally spoke again. "I'm sorry, Chelsea." The words arrived too late to save us, but not too late to matter. I stood alone in the dark kitchen, listening to the man who once made me feel invisible break apart on the other end of the phone. And for the first time since our marriage ended, I no longer wanted Ethan to suffer. I just wanted to be free. Ethan came to the house on a Sunday afternoon carrying flowers I knew he didn't choose himself. White roses, too formal, too expensive, not personal enough. The old Ethan would have brought sunflowers because he remembered they were my favorite since I was 22 years old. But the man standing on my front porch now looked like someone trying desperately to remember how to be human again. I opened the door slowly, but didn't invite him inside immediately. Chicago wind swept snow across the driveway, while Ethan stood there in a dark wool coat, looking older than 59 for the first time in his life. Not because of wrinkles, because regret ages people faster than time ever could. "I just want to talk," he said quietly. For a moment, I almost said no, not out of anger, self-protection. But then, I looked into his eyes and realized something important. The man standing before me no longer believed he was untouchable, and strangely enough, that made him less frightening than he'd been in years. I stepped aside, silently. Ethan entered the house, slowly looking around like a ghost revisiting somewhere sacred. Everything inside remained mostly unchanged. The framed photographs. The piano neither of us ever learned properly. The soft gray blankets I always kept folded neatly across the living room couch. Only one thing was missing now. Us. Ethan noticed it too. I could tell by the way his eyes lingered on the empty spaces between objects instead of the objects themselves. "I forgot how quiet this house feels," he said softly. I crossed my arms. "You were rarely here long enough to notice." The truth landed heavily between us. Ethan nodded faintly. I deserved that. That alone startled me. For years, conversations with Ethan felt like emotional combat. Deflection, manipulation, ego, excuses. But today, he sounded tired. We sat across from each other in the living room, while winter light faded slowly outside the windows. The flowers remained untouched on the coffee table between us. Finally, Ethan looked at me carefully. "You look different." I almost smiled faintly. "So do you." A humorless laugh escaped him. "Yeah." Silence settled over the room. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "I lost the Milwaukee deal. I already suspected that. Rachel warned me 2 days earlier. The lenders were preparing to restructure portions of the project after additional audit exposure." Still hearing Ethan say it aloud felt surreal. "That project meant everything to you," I said softly. "It was supposed to." The way he answered chilled me slightly. Not arrogant anymore. Empty. He leaned forward, slowly rubbing both hands over his face. For years I thought success would eventually make me feel secure. I listened silently. But every time I made more money, I just became more afraid of losing it. That sounded painfully honest. Ethan looked around the room again. "You know what's crazy? What I spent years convincing myself I outgrew this life." His eyes finally met mine again. But this was the only real thing I ever had. My chest tightened painfully. Because once upon a time, I would have melted hearing those words. But heartbreak changes timing. Sometimes truth arrives too late to repair the damage it finally acknowledges. Ethan swallowed hard. "I was cruel to you." The understatement almost made me laugh. "You called me replaceable?" Pain flashed across his face immediately. I know. No, I said quietly. I don't think you do. The room fell silent again. Then something inside me finally cracked open. Not rage, truth. For years I whispered I kept trying to become easier to love. Ethan stared at me wordlessly. I changed my hair because of comments you made. I stopped talking about my opinions because you always sounded annoyed. I spent nights wondering if I was too old, too emotional, too boring. My throat tightened painfully, and the entire time I thought, if I just tried harder, maybe you'd look at me the way you used to. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I kept going because after decades of silence, the truth demanded space. You know what hurt most? I asked softly. It wasn't Sophia. His eyes opened again slowly. It was watching the man I loved slowly start treating me like my loyalty had no value. Tears burned in Ethan's eyes now. Actual tears, but I wasn't finished. You made me feel invisible in my own marriage. The words echoed through the room. And finally, Ethan stopped defending himself. No excuses, no blaming stress, no calling me emotional. He just sat there absorbing the damage he created. After a long silence, he whispered, I hated getting older. The honesty surprised me. I looked at you, he continued shakily, and instead of seeing the woman who stayed beside me through everything, I saw time. I stared at him quietly. Ethan's voice broke slightly, and Sophia made me feel young again. There it was, the pathetic, fragile truth beneath all the destruction. Not love, fear. Fear of aging, fear of irrelevance, fear of mortality. I leaned back slowly. And was it worth it? Ethan looked down at his hands for a very long time before answering. No. The sadness in that single word filled the room completely. Snow drifted softly outside while silence wrapped around us both. Then Ethan looked at me again with an expression I had never seen before. Not authority, not pride, vulnerability. Come back to me. The words landed gently, desperately. Too late. I closed my eyes briefly. God. A part of me had dreamed about hearing those words for months, maybe years, but something fundamental inside me had changed now, because I finally understood something women often learn far too late. Being chosen after disrespect is not the same thing as being valued all along. I opened my eyes again. No. Ethan looked shattered instantly. Chelsea. No, I repeated softly. I can forgive you someday, but I can't go backward. His breathing became uneven. I still love you. I believed him. Strangely enough, I actually did. But love without respect becomes emotional starvation eventually. And I had starved long enough. You loved me most once you realized you could lose me, I said quietly. Ethan lowered his head. Because he knew I was right. I would do anything to fix this, he whispered. I looked at the man I once built my entire future around, and suddenly, I didn't see a villain anymore, just a deeply flawed human being who destroyed the best thing in his life because he mistook admiration for happiness. I don't hate you, Ethan, I admitted softly. His eyes lifted toward mine immediately. But I can't keep abandoning myself to save you. That sentence broke something inside him completely. I saw it happen in real time. For years, Ethan believed I would always sacrifice my own emotional survival for him. Now, he finally understood that version of me was gone. Tears slipped silently down his face. I'm so sorry. And this time I believed he meant it. The tragedy was that sincere apologies cannot resurrect dead marriages. Not after years of emotional erosion, not after humiliation, not after betrayal. Some things break too slowly to ever fully heal. Ethan stood shakily a few minutes later. Neither of us knew what else to say anymore. At the front door, he paused, then quietly asked the question I think he feared most. Do you love him? I knew he meant Gabriel. I thought carefully before answering. I love who I am when I'm treated with kindness. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, because he understood exactly what that meant. He nodded once, then walked out into the falling snow alone. I watched him disappear down the driveway, feeling sadness, relief, grief, and freedom all at once. And for the first time since my marriage ended, I realized choosing myself was not cruelty. It was survival. Spring arrived in Chicago quietly that year. After months of snow court hearings, scandal, and emotional wreckage, the city slowly softened beneath warmer sunlight. Trees along the Riverwalk began blooming again. Restaurant patios reopened, and people stepped outside like survivors returning to life after a long winter. I understood that feeling better than anyone. For the first time in decades, my mornings belonged entirely to me. No waiting for Ethan to come home. No anxiety over his moods. No shrinking myself to keep peace inside a marriage already dying. Freedom felt unfamiliar at first, then addictive. The divorce settlement finalized 3 weeks after Ethan came to the house. The outcome shocked nearly everyone in Chicago's business world. Rachel Levin's forensic team uncovered enough documentation to establish my legal connection to foundational partnership assets tied directly to Walker Development Group's expansion history. In simpler terms, the empire Ethan spent years convincing me I had no right to had been partially built on my name all along. The final settlement included substantial ownership compensation, investment holdings, and financial restitution far beyond Ethan's original offer. Ironically, the woman he called replaceable walked away with enough wealth to never depend on another person again. But strangely enough, money no longer felt like the most important part of any of it. Peace did. One warm Thursday afternoon, I sat beside the Chicago River drinking coffee while watching sunlight ripple across the water. Gabriel joined me a few minutes later, carrying pastries from a nearby bakery. You always order too much, I teased softly. He sat beside me, smiling faintly. And you always pretend you won't eat any. The ease between us felt natural now. Not dramatic, not desperate, just calm. I used to think love needed intensity to feel real. Now I understood something different. Peace is its own kind of intimacy. Gabriel handed me a paper cup. You seem lighter lately. I looked out across the river. I think I finally stopped mourning the marriage. He nodded quietly. That doesn't mean the years didn't matter. I know. And I did know. That was the strange thing about healing. It doesn't erase love. It simply changes your relationship to the pain attached to it. I still loved pieces of who Ethan used to be, but I no longer confused that love with a reason to sacrifice myself. Gabriel leaned back slightly on the bench. So he said carefully, have you decided what you want to do with my life, with your future? I smiled faintly. A few months earlier, that question would have terrified me. Now, it felt exciting. I've been thinking about something. Gabriel waited patiently. There are so many women my age starting over after divorce, I said quietly. Women who spent decades supporting husbands only to realize they have no financial protection, no confidence, no idea how to rebuild. Gabriel listened silently while I continued. I keep thinking about how close I came to disappearing emotionally. My throat tightened slightly. If I hadn't found those documents, if Rachel hadn't helped me, if you hadn't reminded me I mattered. I looked away briefly, I don't know who I would have become. Gabriel's voice softened. But you did find yourself. I nodded slowly, and suddenly I realized exactly what I wanted. I want to create something for women like that. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. What kind of something? A foundation, I said quietly. Legal support? Financial education? Emotional recovery resources for older women going through divorce. The idea had been growing inside me for weeks now. Not revenge. Purpose. Gabriel smiled slowly. I think that sounds exactly like you. That sentence settled warmly inside my chest. Not because he admired me, because he saw me clearly. There's a difference. A breeze moved gently through the trees while people walked along the river behind us, laughing beneath spring sunlight. For the first time in years, life no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something opening in front of me. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. There's something I should probably tell you. I turned toward him curiously. What he looked almost nervous, which shocked me. Men like Gabriel Bennett rarely appeared uncertain. I spent a long time convincing myself not to say this. My heartbeat slowed strangely. Gabriel. He smiled faintly. I think I've loved you for a very long time, Chelsea. The world seemed to pause around me. Not dramatically, softly, like a door opening instead of an explosion. I stared at him quietly. And what surprised me most was not the confession itself. Deep down, I think I already knew. It was the absence of pressure afterward. Gabriel didn't rush to fill silence, didn't demand an answer, didn't try to possess the moment. He simply sat there honestly. And after years with Ethan, honesty felt almost sacred. Finally, I smiled softly. You picked a very beautiful day to tell me. Gabriel laughed quietly beneath his breath. I was trying not to terrify you. You don't terrify me. His expression softened. Good. I looked down at my coffee cup carefully. After everything that happened with Ethan, I don't think I know how to rush into love anymore. Gabriel nodded immediately. I'm not asking you to. And there it was again. Respect. Simple, uncomplicated, real. I thought about Ethan then, about all the years I spent believing being chosen by a powerful man made me valuable. But sitting beside Gabriel now, I finally understood something deeper. The richest thing a person can offer another human being is emotional safety. Not money, not status, not admiration. Safety. The ability to exist fully without fear of becoming smaller. I used to think the title of this story was about replacing Ethan with someone wealthier, I admitted quietly. Gabriel smiled slightly. And now, I looked out toward the water sparkling beneath sunlight. Now I think richer means something completely different. His eyes remained on me quietly. I spent years married to a man with enormous wealth, who made me feel emotionally poor. I swallowed softly. But kindness changes people. Respect changes people. Peace changes people. Gabriel reached over slowly, gently taking my hand. And for the first time in a very long time, the touch of a man didn't make me feel anxious about losing myself. It made me feel safe being myself. Later that evening, I stood alone inside the office space I had just rented for the foundation. The walls were empty. The furniture hadn't arrived yet, but sunlight poured through the windows beautifully. I imagined women sitting here someday, women crying after betrayal, women terrified of starting over at 50, 60, 70 years old, women convinced their lives ended because a man stopped choosing them. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I wanted to tell every single one of them. Your value does not decrease because someone failed to recognize it. I stood in the center of the empty office, smiling quietly to myself. Not because my life had become perfect, because it finally belonged to me again. 6 months later, I stood behind a podium, overlooking a ballroom filled with women who looked like different versions of myself. Some were divorced, some widowed, some still trapped inside marriages slowly eroding their confidence. But every face in that room carried the same quiet question I once carried: can I rebuild my life after being made to feel unimportant? The banner behind me read, "The Morales Foundation for Women Rebuilding After Divorce." Seeing my own name there still felt surreal sometimes. Not because of pride, because for so many years I barely existed outside the shadow of Ethan Walker. Now I had built something entirely my own. The ballroom buzzed softly with conversation, while volunteers moved between tables, handing out information packets about legal aid, financial literacy programs, therapy resources, and housing assistance. Women hugged each other, cried with each other, laughed with each other. Healing has a sound, and that night, I could hear it everywhere. Rachel Levin stood near the stage talking with several attorneys who volunteered for the foundation. Across the room, Gabriel spoke quietly with donors beside the auction display, looking calm and elegant as always. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not possessively, not proudly, just warmly. And somehow, after everything I survived, that kind of love meant more to me than dramatic passion ever could. A volunteer adjusted the microphone. "We're ready whenever you are, Ms. Morales." Ms. Morales, not Mrs. Walker. I stepped toward the podium slowly, while applause filled the room. For one brief moment, emotion tightened my throat unexpectedly. Because a year ago, I honestly believed my life was ending. Now I stood in front of hundreds of women helping build new beginnings. Funny how pain transforms once you survive it. I looked out across the crowd carefully. I spent almost 30 years believing my value depended on how deeply someone else loved me. I began softly. The room grew completely quiet. And when my marriage collapsed, I thought my life had collapsed with it. Several women nodded immediately. I understood those faces. The grief, the shame, the fear of becoming invisible after a certain age. Society teaches women that being wanted is the same thing as being valuable. That lesson destroys lives. I thought losing my husband meant losing my identity. I continued. But eventually I realized something important. I paused briefly. I didn't lose myself when my marriage ended. My voice steadied. I lost myself years earlier trying to keep a man comfortable while slowly abandoning who I was. The silence in the ballroom felt emotional now, heavy, truthful, healing. I glanced briefly toward Gabriel again before continuing. There's a specific kind of heartbreak women don't talk about enough. My hands rested lightly against the podium. It's not just betrayal. It's realizing you spent years shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's version of what made you lovable. Several women wiped tears quietly. I swallowed hard myself. Some of us stopped speaking up. Some stopped dreaming. Some stopped recognizing ourselves entirely. The room remained utterly still. But surviving heartbreak changes you. I smiled faintly. And if you survive it honestly, it can also return you to yourself. Applause broke out softly. Not loud, emotional. The kind people give when something painful feels understood. After the speech ended, dozens of women approached me individually. One woman in her 70s cried while telling me her husband left after 41 years of marriage. Another admitted she secretly stayed in a cruel relationship because she didn't know how to manage finances alone. One woman whispered, "I thought I was too old to start over." I held her hands gently. "You're not. And I meant it with my entire heart. Much later that evening, after most guests left, I stepped outside the ballroom onto the quiet terrace overlooking downtown Chicago. Warm, summer air moved softly through the city while lights glittered endlessly below. Chicago looked beautiful tonight, not lonely anymore, alive. I leaned against the railing, breathing deeply. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Ethan. I turned slowly. I hadn't seen him in almost 4 months. The difference was startling. He looked thinner now, quieter, less polished somehow. Not ruined, just human. For years, Ethan carried himself like a man untouchable by consequence. Now he looked like someone finally learning how fragile life really is. "I wasn't sure you'd want me here," he admitted quietly. I studied him carefully. I wasn't sure either. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. I deserved that. We stood in silence for a moment, looking out over the city together. Then Ethan glanced back toward the ballroom. "You built something incredible." The sincerity in his voice surprised me. "Thank you? I mean it." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets awkwardly. "I've been following the foundation online." I smiled faintly. "Rachel says you donated anonymously twice." He looked slightly embarrassed. "Well, I figured arguing with her about publicity sounded exhausting." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. For one brief second, we almost sounded like old friends. Then reality settled gently back between us. Ethan looked older beneath the city lights tonight. But strangely enough, he also looked calmer. "What happened with the company?" I asked quietly. He exhaled slowly. "I sold most of it." I blinked slightly. "That must have been hard." "It was." Then he looked directly at me. "But losing you was harder." The honesty in that sentence carried no manipulation anymore. Just grief. And strangely enough, hearing it no longer gave me satisfaction. Only closure. Ethan leaned against the railing beside me. "You know what I finally realized? What I spent years chasing admiration because I confused it with happiness." His eyes lowered briefly. "Sophia admired my money, my status, my power." Then he looked at me again. "You loved me when I had none of those things." Emotion tightened painfully in my chest, because despite everything, that part had always been true. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan smiled sadly. "You were never replaceable, Chelsea." The words hit me differently now than they would have months ago. Not victorious, just healing. Because I no longer needed him to say them. I already knew. Ethan looked toward the ballroom doors where Gabriel had quietly appeared inside the building. He saw Ethan immediately, but didn't interrupt. Ethan noticed him too. A faint smile touched his face. "He's a better man than I was." I looked toward Gabriel carefully. "Yes," I said softly, "he is." Ethan nodded once, then he stepped away from the railing. "I hope you're happy, Chelsea." And for the first time in years, answering honestly felt easy. "I finally am." Ethan gave me one last look before walking away into the quiet summer night alone. I watched him disappear down the terrace hallway, feeling sadness for what we lost, but gratitude for what I survived. A moment later, Gabriel stepped outside beside me. "You okay?" I smiled softly while looking out over the city. "Yeah." He slipped his hand gently into mine. And standing there beneath the Chicago skyline, I finally understood the real meaning behind everything that happened. I never replaced Ethan with someone richer. I replaced fear with peace. I replaced humiliation with self-respect. I replaced loneliness with healing. And most importantly, I replaced the version of myself that believed love required suffering. After surviving my divorce, I learned something I wish every woman understood much earlier in life: being abandoned does not make you worthless. For years, I believed my marriage defined me. I thought being a good wife meant sacrificing endlessly, staying quiet, forgiving everything, and shrinking parts of myself to keep someone else comfortable. Like many women, especially women my age, I confused loyalty with self-erasure. And the terrifying thing is, you often don't realize it's happening until you wake up one day and no longer recognize yourself. When Ethan called me replaceable, it broke something inside me. But looking back now, I understand that moment also saved me. Because sometimes pain forces us to finally see the truth. The truth was never that I was too old, too boring, or too difficult to love. The truth was that I had spent decades giving my value to someone else and waiting for him to hand it back. No relationship should require you to disappear in order to keep it alive. Love without respect becomes emotional starvation, and no amount of history, money, marriage, or memories can make cruelty healthy. But here's the beautiful part. Life does not end because someone stops choosing you. Sometimes life finally begins the moment you choose yourself. Starting over in your 50s, 60s, or 70s is terrifying. I know that firsthand. But it's also possible. Healing is possible. Peace is possible. Joy is possible. And being loved properly with kindness, honesty, and emotional safety is possible too. Most importantly, your worth does not decrease simply because someone failed to recognize it. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after heartbreak or betrayal? And wherever you're watching from tonight, tell me your city and what time it is there. I read far more comments than you probably realize, and your stories matter to me too. And if stories about healing, strength, second chances, and finding your value again speak to your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are so many more stories still waiting to be told.